Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am joined by the design critic and curator Vera Sacchetti. Vera is a graduate of SVA's design criticism program and has written for publications like Design Observer, the Avery Review, and Metropolis. Her recent work, though, has revolved around curating, where she's one half of the curatorial initiative Foreign Legion and was the associate curator of the fourth Istanbul Biennial, whose theme was a school of schools and kind of interrogates and reflects on the state of design education. In our conversation, Vera and I talk about her move from designing to writing and our shared love of the site Design Observer and the influence that that had on our early education. We also talk about why she left her career to study criticism, her move to curating, and the process and thinking behind the Istanbul Biennial. Vera's passion is contagious, and I found this conversation just so delightful and inspiring. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the director's commentary for the podcast. Each month I share additional content, episode previews, and other essays and ideas related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Vera Sacchetti. The second decrit group, or were you in the first?
Yeah, I was, class number two, class of 2011. We were batch number 2, and we were 11, and it was really, really great because it was just such a diverse group, like so international, and I came from Lisbon, Portugal,
right,
where I grew up, and I left when I was 25, and when I left, I left behind sort of let's say, the start of a career as a graphic designer. And I studied graphic design. I love graphic design. It's still my first passion, and first loves are very difficult to sort of forget. And I worked then as a exhibition and book designer, so that gave me a lot of interesting sort of insights. Just sort of like spatial matters, wayfinding issues, like how design and space come together, and so on. And I was doing all these like super interesting books, and I really had a charmed life. It was great. But then one day saw the Decrit website, and I just knew that I had to go and do that program. And the program hadn't even started. It was just like an ad, not an ad, but it was like I think it was an article somewhere, where the first website of Decrit, and the program hadn't even started. It was just like an announcement for what it's going to be. And then what happened was I couldn't afford studying in the United States because I come from Europe, where like universities are free.
Right. You don't have to brag about it.
No, I don't mean it like in a way. I don't mean it like.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean.
It was just shocking for me to understand how much people pay for higher education in the United States. It hadn't crossed my mind, or I knew it maybe, but it was when I was faced with the cost of tuition for a graduate program that I was like, it's not going to work out. It was a dream, but it's going to die. Fortunately, I got a scholarship, and I was accepted in the program. So I got to Decrit with a Fulbright, which was very prestigious in the United States. Nobody knows. Okay, nobody outside the United States knows what a Fulbright is. Nobody cares. But once you get to the U.S. with a Fulbright, people are like, "You're a genius."
Right?
I'm like, I don't think so, but it's just like definitely like a stamp in your face. It's like people are like, "Wow, you are amazing." But let me tell you. If you are not American, it's not that difficult to get a Fulbright. Just putting it out there, encouraging everyone.
The secret is out.
Yeah, exactly. And so there was a super diverse group of people, from India, from Austria, from Portugal, from the U.S. A lot of people from the U.S. but really diverse also backgrounds, people that
Right.
came from, English literature, journalism background, archaeology and architecture, design, graphic design, art history. So it was just like a really mixed bunch. I have to say, Alice Twemlow did a great job in putting this
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
It was a very good curation of a group there. And it was an amazing time, completely changed my life, and turned my life upside down.
I mean,
definitely.
my sense of you and your career and in the research that I was doing, kind of preparing for this, that program seemed like a turning point in your career. And I guess what I'm curious about is what was it about that program, like seeing that, being a designer, having a career that, seemed like it could have been fine. What was it about this idea of design criticism, this idea of writing maybe? And you were like, yes, that's the thing that I want to do. And then that you would go to a other country to study it. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of like what that was about, or where those interests came in?
Yeah, well, I have to say, like, it started with my bachelor in graphic design. I had a wonderful teacher, a man called Mario Mora, and he was my design criticism teacher. So we had a design criticism course.
Oh,
First, he
interesting.
taught design history, and then he taught design criticism the year after.
So what was that like? What was that class? What happened in that
It was
class?
insane. It was insane. So he basically was like, he was like this like super critical dude. He was quite young. It was a time in that program. I studied in Porto, so
Okay.
the second biggest city in Portugal. And it was a time at that program when a bunch of the older faculty members retired. So there was like a bunch of like young-ish teachers who were around 32, 33. So you had like a lot of like sort of fresh ideas coming into the program. And that professor was one of these younger people. And he came with all these ideas, and he got us all into like reading about graphic design and graphic design criticism. He got us into history of graphic design, Megs, the classics, Abbott Miller and Ellen Lupton, reading all the stuff, Emigre, reading, and reading Design Observer. These were the years in which Design Observer had its inception. So, Michael Beirut, Jessica Helfand, we were reading all these people. I was reading all these people, and I was just like, oh my God, these are like, these are amazing, amazing people. And he just got us to think about this professor of mine just got us to think about what we were doing in a critical way, which was completely new for me. And so I guess it started there, and I held on to some of these emigre issues as sort of sacred text. I admired people like Ellen Lupton in a very unhealthy, pretentious way. And Stephen Heller and Rick Poynter all these people. They were just like I was such a fangirl. And these people were insanely talented. They are insanely talented. And they, at those times, like this was the early 2000s, like late 90s, early 2000s, they just completely changed the landscape of graphic design criticism, let's say. And I guess it was then that I understood the power of this thing. And it just stayed with me. And then when I was doing exhibitions and books, and that was great, but I just wanted more. I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to think about, why is it that we're making a book about this? Like, I didn't want to be the person that stands at the end of the chain and sort of people just pass things on to him, like, so just make a nice layout and put this in there. It's great.
Right.
I worked in pretty amazing projects. Like I did museums from scratch, like all the graphic identity plus wayfinding plus the editorials, like all of that stuff. And that was like pretty amazing work for a graphic designer. And those commissions were insanely amazing, but I don't know what it was, but I guess somehow that had stayed with me for my bachelor's. When I started reading about decrit, it just sort of came back, and I just wanted to do that instead of designing. I wanted to be reflecting about design or thinking about design or contributing to a critical understanding of graphic design. And mind you, at this point, I didn't know anything, or maybe something, but not that much about architecture, about product design even.
Right.
So Decrit was a fundamentally transformative experience in the sense that it opened my horizons up to so many things that I had very little clue about, like urbanism, like architecture, like product design, like so I came with the graphic design understanding and knowledge, and then Stephen Heller was my professor for God's sake. It was like It was like, oh my God. And Ellen Lupton came in one time as a guest lecturer, and I had this really awkward moment where I just said, oh my God, you're the reason why I'm here. And just awkward way, and I just realized I shouldn't have said that, but it was just like my dreams were coming true. Like attending this program was every dream I've ever had was coming true. And so that's why, but I had no idea what I was going to do when I got out of there. I thought that I was just going to do it and then go back to Lisbon and do design again. I thought. Yeah. And then that just didn't happen. And I didn't even know how to write when I got to that program. You know what I mean? And writing also not in my mother tongue, right? So that's a whole different other thing. And and then 2 years later, I was just a different person. And then again, my dream was to one day write for Design Observer. Okay, like that. If you ask me, like day one, what is your dream? My dream is to write for Design Observer. And by the end of my time at Decrit, I had interned for Julie Lasky at Change Observer, and I had actually written for it. So it was like, okay, wow, amazing! Like everything I've ever wanted in life has been accomplished. So
it's so amazing how similar we are. Like everything you just said is almost exactly the same for me. So I guess I'm a little bit younger than you are, because I think the Decrit program started, I think it was my second year of undergraduate, like 2008, 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. But I had been reading Design Observer since it began. And so for a long time, just saw writing as part of what it meant to be a designer. I didn't realize that was abnormal in any way. And so then I went to undergrad, having read, these sites, Speak Up and Immigrate, and then realized that that's not what every graphic designer does, and was kind of thrown off a little bit. And then, I was like halfway through my undergrad program and saw Decrit, and that was the first time I heard the word design criticism, or the first time that term suddenly made sense, or realized that this was kind of like a separate thing. And so then that's kind of where that term and interest became a part of my life and my practice. And then I graduated and went working for a while, very much like you, kind of was like, these are great projects. I'm doing really interesting work, but I also want to know why I'm doing these things and why these things exist. And so then I went to grad school. By this time, Decrit had kind of reformatted as a 1 year, which I totally get, but if I was going to go back to school, I wanted an MFA, and I wanted to spend 2 years. And so I went to MICA to study with Ellen Lupton, who I had been reading for half of my life, and then studied under her. And that experience changed my life. And now, a couple years out of it, I'm just starting to see the effects and the things that I learned and was thinking about at that time. I feel like they're just starting to make sense now, kind of years later. And so everything you're saying is like, I totally know exactly what you're talking about.
It was just so, I have to say, Alice and Stephen, when they started that program, they were onto something. And Alice had such an amazing roster of people teaching and guest lecturing. She literally grabbed anyone who passed by New York City. She was like, come and do a lunchtime lecture for my student. And I have to say, as with everything in life, I guess you only take out or get out whatever you put into it, right? So I lived and breathed that department. I was literally living there for too long. And we had this key, and I was just sitting there all the time, and I would ask questions. and for me, you have to understand, like coming from a country where like it's a fundamentally different way of thinking and acting when you go to school. Like you're not, it's completely different from the American system. So all this like change in mindset that if you want something, you need to go and ask for it and get it and like and work for it. And that people give you chances rather than just saying no to you on the go. Like this was like, I cannot explain how much of a change that was for me. Like it just completely changed my way of thinking. It just completely opened up my eyes to so many things. And the other interesting thing is that, then I suddenly knew so much about all these other parts of design that I hadn't considered before. And then what happened was, and I wanted to stay in the States for a while because, I wrote a thesis that was really successful at the time, or it went really well, and I made a lot of contacts. I got to know a lot of people, and I was really interested in pursuing that, but visa issues, and so I went back to Europe, and what was very interesting for me is that still in Europe, there's so many people that don't have that attitude. And that paved the way for me, or I paved the way for myself here.
Right.
With that attitude. Like, it's just a very different way of looking at things. And what I have to say is, like, the most amazing thing I got out of Decrypt was the fact that with that program, you found out your voice. You understood what is it that you want to add to this landscape. Like, it's not just about, oh, this exhibition sucks or whatever. It's so much more about defining who you are as a critic. Like who are you? What are you interested in? What are you about? Like, and trying to use that voice once you've honed it, in the best possible way. Like how can you contribute to the realm of design in all its sort of like vastness with your voice? And that's what I got out of Decrypt. And that search is what I've been doing since I got out of there, I guess. Yeah. And it's taken me to pretty amazing places. But what I want to say is that I'm still searching.
Right.
I don't know yet. Right. But what I've discovered so far is pretty cool. But I don't know yet.
You mentioned earlier that you thought, you would kind of go to this program and then you would just go back to the same type of work you were doing. You'd just be a kind of designer again. I would love to kind of hear a little bit more about why that didn't happen necessarily. And this kind of turn to the more critical, more writing side. Was that a kind of conscious decision? Was that, like you were saying, you just kind of saw an opportunity there and kind of went for it? And then, hopefully related, can you talk more about that kind of that voice and that point of view and kind of what you discovered about your role as a critic in the program and also kind of the way you're thinking about it now?
I mean, I feel like again, like this professor I had in Porto was like a very influential role model, let's say. And he when he was teaching us, he started also having a blog. And let's go back to the early 2000s. People did that. Like that was like a thing. People like had blogs, like they just wrote like things and they kind of threw it out there, and no pictures, right? Just like literally just text, like just writing, like 200 words, and they wrote, and every day they would put something else, and it was funny, and you would follow these people, and there's no smartphones yet, people are not like on Instagram yet, so so he was like doing that, he was writing, and so I thought that was so cool. Like he had something to say, so he put it out there, and the internet was the great equalizer, and everybody was like paying attention to each other. Everybody had the blogspot.com address, and so on. And that was like a long time ago. And I just thought, I guess what I thought is that I would learn more about writing and being a critic and understanding better how to like articulate my opinions about things, and that I would be able to maybe do the same thing, like continue to be a graphic designer, but maybe on the side do some like blog. I don't know.
Right.
I didn't think it through. I'm going to tell you this. But then what happened is that what I learned is that writing is as much of a craft as is designing. And I then just became more interested in the craft of writing than in the craft of designing. And the other thing I understood is that there is a dire lack of voices in the field, and that everybody should be able to contribute to it. And, and the fact that there are no voices just means that there should be a lot of voices. Because it's so refreshing, right? Isn't it nice when you talk to people and they don't have the same opinion that you do? Like, isn't it nice to have like a variety of perspectives? The world is such a complex place. Like, why can't we just embrace the fact that we can all think differently about things, you know, within reason, right? Let's not go crazy, but let's talk about, I don't know, an exhibition review, or like a building, or, you know, or a chair, and you can talk about those things and have a different opinion about those things. Of course, what happened very quickly for me is that because I wrote a thesis that was a critique of social design initiatives done by American designers in so-called developing countries in that period, like, I very quickly became very much interested in social issues that are around design. And I also very quickly understood that graphic or any kind of design cannot be criticized or written about in a vacuum, but you of course have to deal with all the sort of political implications, social implications, cultural implications. And so really that was a great discovery for me, because, you know, it's a way to become a cultural critic of the contemporary, at least for me, because that's my interest, is the now. And I just thought that could be an interesting way to go. And how was I going to do that? I was not sure. But first I just tried to get a job, and that was my first job after Decrit. Was I went back to Portugal and I worked for a biennial of design as a communications person. So basically doing PR for the international press. And very soon after that, I got a job at Domus magazine in Milan. And then I became the web editor of Domus Web for about a year and a half. And we, you know, and there, you know, you have to churn out 6 articles a day. So that was kind of a good school for writing. You know, if you ever think you can't write, like, you know, that's what you're saying. Really just something you have to train every day. It's like drawing, like everything, you know, and so the writing, definitely aspect of dedicating myself to writing, it became more and more important through that job as well, because writing for me is really a way to think, right? So it's a way to articulate my ideas, and it's a craft, like I was just telling you, designing is a craft, so it's something that you have to practice every day. At least I have to, because otherwise I can't make sense of the world around me. So it's through writing that I can make sense of things that are around me. And what I discovered is that there are not that many people that know how to write, and I thought everyone knew how to write, and yet more and more I am surprised by encountering a world where I find that not that many people actually know how to write. What does that even mean, right? I have to see that Decrit trained us in a way that we always learned that you don't have to write about complex issues in really complicated words. Right? You can write plainly, but still talk about very complex things. And that probably is going to get you a bigger audience than if you just use jargon, right? So one thing is, who are you writing for, right? And those issues were very present at Decrit, where we're never considered part of the academia or the academic world, right? So we are very much in between, you know, like you could write a column for newspaper, or, you know, I was writing for Domus Web, but I was really writing about a lot of pedestrian things, like a lot of the time. But that is great, because these kinds of issues, if we continue talking about them in our little silos and like using all these like references that only we understand, and like sort of smirk at the fact that, oh, you used that reference, only 10 other people in the world can get that. You know, that's just so sad, and we're going to die, and we're going to become extinguished like a species that cannot thrive. And therefore, for me, this pursuit of the trying to not do that is very important. So trying to like open up the horizons, open up the conversation, invite more people into the table, bring more people, more voices to the table is so important and so fundamental. And
it's interesting that you say that, though, because it's a very, to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, it's actually, I talked to Ellen Lupton about this a lot, because so much of her and Abbott's early writing was more on the academic side, and they, really, Ellen especially, really kind of shifted away from that. And she and I talked about that when I was studying there, and when I interviewed her for this podcast, we talked about that, and she said basically the exact same thing you said, is that she wanted to write in a more inclusive way, in a way that could reach more people, and was not done in a way that limited understanding or limited kind of who could read this and who could participate in the conversation.
I mean, and that's definitely one of the ways to think about it. But on the other hand, you also have to think about it in a very selfish way. Like, do you want to survive? Do you want your profession to actually exist in 5 years? And stop writing like using like 10-syllable words that nobody understands. Like, it's just not going to work out, because especially in the world where we live in today, where people are less and less spending time reading complicated things.
Right.
Like, I'm not talking about dumbing down. I'm not talking about dumbing down.
Right.
I'm talking about using plain words to talk about complex things, which, as Ellen very rightfully said, allows you to include more people in the conversation and allows more voices to, participate, which is what we want.
Right.
We don't want this to, like, this is already such a niche,
Right. I mean, that's one of my big interests, and it comes up on the podcast a lot, is that there's a difference between writing for a wide audience and dumbing something down. And the type of writing that I'm interested in, both in reading and in writing myself, and the types of people that I talk to, I think share a similar interest, is not in the dumbing down, but it is taking these complex issues, topics, subjects, ideas, and writing them in a way that the most people can understand them. So I'm 100% on board with what you're saying. I'm curious, though, about this idea of writing also being a practice, and I'm curious if you think your design training and coming from a graphic design background influences how you think about writing, and especially questions around audience and kind of how you communicate something clearly. I think these are very design questions also. Do you think that background influences how you think about writing?
I have to say definitely, because, and I also have to say that Decrit, if you think about who came up with the program and structured it, they're all coming from a graphic design background. Yeah. And I feel like there's so many interesting graphic designers that go on to do so many like crazy things. Like, I'm just thinking about Prem Krishnamurthy right now. Just thinking about him, like, he just popped into my mind. Like, he's such an amazing guy. I mean, he's a graphic designer. Yeah. Originally, but he's so much more than that nowadays. And I feel like there's a lot of things that you learned as a graphic designer that really, at least me, they really helped me in my practice today. I mean, I feel like I wouldn't be able to pinpoint, like, it's not because you learn a certain kind of methodology or anything, but it's just this kind of analysis of communication and like this knowledge about what communicates what and how to communicate what, that really helps, this like understanding of hierarchies of like visual communication is also very much, when applied to a completely different way of working or a completely different medium, let's say, as writing, or words, it really comes in handy, I have to say. So definitely. And I find that graphic designers also have kind of a weird fetish with words, like most of the time. I don't mean it in a bad way.
But,
it's definitely something that comes with the trade, I would say. Yeah. And that said, I have to say that I'm very sorry that I don't write about graphic design at all, actually.
Right.
But it's, first love.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I actually think I was actually thinking about that recently, about how so much of the early Decrit group, it was much more graphic design focused than it is now. And not that that's a good or bad thing, but I think these silos and these definitions between different types of design are getting a lot blurrier. And I actually think that leads in nicely to the Istanbul Design Biennial, which now hearing you talk about your interests and your backgrounds actually feels like it kind of is a culmination in a sense of all of these things you're talking about, kind of thinking about the contemporary, thinking about the kind of the politics of design, all kind of play a role in this, thinking about education and process. All of these things you're talking about actually kind of manifest themselves in this biennial. And so you were a co-curator of the 2018?
Yeah, so actually associate curator was the role, and, of the fourth Istanbul Design Biennial, which was, it was held last year from September to November 2018. And you are totally right when you say that's a culmination, because for me it was as well. I have to say that, after Domus, I was lucky enough to start working in a bunch of projects that were directly like following up on the interests that I had developed while at Decred. So this idea of like exploring more sort of like social concerns around design, political concerns around design, and so on. And I was involved first in the 2014 Design Biennial in Ljubljana, which was where I was an editor for the catalog and advising the curator. And it was all of it was all about this idea of post-industrial design scenario in Europe, and how can we understand better ways to collaborate, and how can the discipline reinvent itself, and how can the biennial reinvent itself. And so this whole exploration was a complete like follow-up of the concerns of my thesis. So I was super happy to be able to work on that. And then that was followed by a couple of other projects, and that really came together in Istanbul. So this obsession with the contemporary, this obsession with understanding how can design change, because the whole idea around that biennial was that, on the one hand, the design field, and I'm understanding it in its broadest sense, needs to change, right? Because it's a discipline that came out of the Industrial Revolution for the most part, when we talk about production, consumption, and so on. And here I'm not talking about graphic design and sort of like mechanization of print and so on, but really like in this broadest idea of design as a tool of the Industrial Revolution, let's say. But when we live in a world that is, very quickly marching towards, our mass extinction and, the end of industry as we know it, we're already experiencing it. Like, how can this discipline thrive, and how can it continue? And again, it's a very selfish question, because I want to continue writing about design, and I want to continue doing about design, but will design be able to like actually survive? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. And I think these exercises, both the Ljubljana Biennial and the Istanbul Design Biennial last year, they were exercises in trying to understand how can this discipline evolve and grow and change and become something else. And at the same time, they were also exercises in trying to understand what is a biennial, and is it interesting as a format? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, what I think is interesting, or at least kind of like personally interesting to me at least, is so much of my research and energies have really shifted in the last couple of years to design education. I teach in both undergraduate and graduate level programs, and really think a lot about what it means to teach graphic design specifically. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, we can just talk about design in 2019, and that the kind of design program that I went through now 10 years ago doesn't really make sense anymore. And I learned a lot of software that I have never used since. And even thinking about the way I was taught design history and kind of the role of the designer feels very ancient already in just 10 years. And so I think for the biennial, you took a really interesting approach by kind of framing these questions all through the lens of education and through the lens of school. And so maybe to kind of set that up, can you talk about that kind of framework and how you arrived at that? And then we can kind of talk about the ideas behind it.
I have to say it was for me, it was definitely like the most challenging and complex project that I've ever been involved in. That said, it was also one of the projects that made me grow the most, and I'm super thankful for that. And I think that what the starting point was, this idea of, design post-industry scenario, how can the discipline change? But actually, instead of asking how can the discipline change, we really have to go to the root of the problem, which would be
right.
the education of this discipline, right? Because
right.
these were sort of the fundamental tenets of what is design, right? And going back and sort of like starting digging into design education, you very quickly come to the conclusion that most of the schools teaching design education everywhere in the world are still following up on some sort of like slightly modified model based on what the Bauhaus was teaching 100 years ago. And that's great. We are in the centenary. Centenary?
Centennial.
Centennial?
Right?
Yeah. Not today. This year, the Bauhaus programming is going to blow up, right?
Yeah.
It's 100 years of Bauhaus. Everybody's going insane. Everybody's like looking at it from whatever perspective they possibly can, which is great. But it's great because we should definitely question it, and we should take this opportunity to change radically the whole design education scenario of the world if we can. Because here we go, like Germany. There was Second World War. All the Bauhauslers went to the U.S. Therefore, Bauhaus models comes to the U.S. The Ulm School. People from the Ulm School then go to Brazil. Brazil then spreads the sort of Bauhaus virus all over South and Latin America. Even today in China, the first museums dedicated to collecting and presenting design are still starting by showing Bauhaus collection.
Oh, interesting.
So this is work that, for example, Zara Arshad has talked about in a conference recently. I mean, it's super interesting research. And we have to say, like, why is it that we're still looking back at this? And also, why are we looking at some sort of like digested, simplified, depoliticized history of what
exactly.
That is such a pity, because if you go back to the beginning of the Bauhaus, it was super critical, super interesting, super transformative, but now it's just commodified.
Right.
We're just churning out. I mean, and then that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, sort of capitalist undertone of this whole endeavor, which is, here we are, we need to graduate, students, there's no more students failing because we need to sort of like keep our universities alive and so on. So what we understood is that this is very much, there's so many things that are sort of wrong with the system. But for us, this biennial was not an effort in here's how you fix the school system or here's how you fix the design education system. Like, that is not what we tried to do. We really tried to go outside of the school and then look at this idea of learning and the educational method as an approach for the discipline. So can we use this as something that will allow the discipline to stay agile, to keep changing, shifting, adapting, learning from others, from the world, from the context, from anything really. And this idea of design as learning as an attitude to sort of keep the discipline alive and to rethink and reshuffle how we think about all of those things. And that was a challenge. So it's pretty abstract and pretty broad. Let's just put it that way. So
I mean, I'll just tell you, my next question is, okay, great. Love that. How do you do that? How do you turn that into a series of exhibitions?
And so what did we do? We said, okay, this is our admittedly very ambitious goal. And by we, I mean the curatorial team, which was Jan Boelen, Belgian curator, Nadine Bota, South African design critic and curator, and me. And we're just like, great, this is an immense tsunami, just like sort of like looking at us, and how are we going to deal with this? So we decided to make it, on the one hand, we had to do an open call because this biennial works is an open call scenario. So we defined this kind of like very broad framework, and then people could apply and send their projects and so on. And based on what we got, which was a lot of applications, we're not expecting so many. So we had more than 700, and we had this kind of meltdown where we had to go through all these in a month and try to make something out of admittedly very good things that came our way, and so on the one hand, we tried to make it very specific to Istanbul, because that's another issue that happens, I guess, with some biennials, that you could have done it there, but you could also have done it kind of anywhere else. So they can just plonk themselves in whatever scenario, but whatever they're doing is not locally specific at all. So that for us was very important. And so we tried to look at projects that could, grow or evolve by the fact that they were being done in Istanbul, or they could interact with the Turkish sort of context, or they could sort of connect the Turkish context to other contexts. So projects that we're talking about the Mediterranean, let's say, or projects that we're talking about a common history between Greece and Turkey, and so on. And so basically we came together, and what we decided to do was to look for that attitude in everything that came up. And so the filter through which everything happened was this permanent attitude of questioning, of wanting to learn, of exchanging knowledge with you and with you, like between the designers themselves and with others, and to sort of like go on and move on like that. And so then the themes that came together were just so diverse, because this attitude can be sort of like found in so many different things. And so it was actually quite daunting at times, but what we did is we decided to then, when the projects were selected, we decided to sort of group them together by theme. So what were they questioning? What were they exploring?
Okay, I see. Yeah.
And then we had a variety of disciplines coming together. So you had people that were doing more digital, people doing more product, people doing more performance, people that are doing more research, people that are doing murals, people that are doing a floating house in the middle of the Bosphorus. So, but all of these projects come together via this sort of lens. But this was just one component, because I told you already that we wanted to question this idea of what a biennial is. We didn't want to do this sort of static exhibition type thing, right? So what we also tried to do is to try to make it something that can learn from itself in a way. So sort of evolves. And so we had, on the one hand, we had an exhibition that was divided into 6 different parts in 6 different venues that were connected by the corridors of our school, which were the streets of Istanbul. And then we had several parts of the exhibition were evolving. So what you saw at the beginning of the biennial was not what you saw at the end. So the installations changed, people interacted with them, things were going on, and we were making notes and showing the evolution of things in the walls and so on. On the other hand, we had a very active public program, which was also a very sort of very much a first for the Istanbul Design Biennial, which is great. I mean, and then that way could bring in so many people more to come see the exhibition, interact with it, and at different levels as well. So you had workshops, you had talks, you had guided tours and so on, but you also had kind of more experimental formats. And then they had something that they called the Academy Day, in which they invited people from schools all over Turkey and also abroad to come and present and work in the exhibition. So in the exhibition spaces, we had what we called classroom spaces, in which people could just have residencies there. So you had people, for example, Nelly Ben Hayoun brought her University of the Underground, and they were there doing a residency for 1 week. Ineke Hans brought University of the Arts Berlin students, for example.
I love that.
Eindhoven was also there. A lot of different schools in Turkey were also there, using the space as spaces that were changing, so they were modular, they could be reconfigured, they could, and that, I think, I can't say that the exhibition was the biennial. I think the biennial was the kind of effort that brought everyone together, by which people changed by interacting with it, that people learned by interacting with it in some way, by participating in a workshop, by doing a tour, by being there on residency, and that was it. And that's how we see it. It was the sort of like massive coming together of a bunch of people to sort of like create this very informal, intangible network of ecosystem, really, of people, of place, of things. And what comes out of it for me is completely unknown. It was a test, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It was a conceptual exercise that was not conceptual at all.
yeah,
But it's made all the more powerful because you don't know what the impact of this in the future is. So what happens is that maybe people met there and they're going to work together now. And maybe people got to know the work of somebody else and they were inspired. And maybe they
yeah.
took some ideas that they got there to their own practice. Or so what I can tell you now is the legacy is, on the one hand, the exhibition is going to travel and it's going to open in sort of more condensed form in May in France at
Oh,
Luma Art,
nice.
which is a cultural campus in the south of France in Arles. And then later in the year, it's going to open at Z33 House for Contemporary Art in Belgium, in Hasselt. So we hope that the discussion is going to continue.
Yeah.
And it's going to continue, hopefully, to inspire people in these different places. And we have a book which we published with Valise called Design is Learning, which is a reader that on the one hand talks a lot about what's happening with design education right now, and also offers some sort of like possible future analysis.
Right.
Combined with some of the attitudes of the participants of the biennial itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very early on in our conversation, you said you talked about how kind of writing was a way of thinking for you. And I feel like this also was a way of thinking and working through things. And I talked to Mimi Zeiger recently, and I kind of asked her about the move, because she just did the U.S. Pavilion for the Venice Biennale. I asked her about kind of moving from writing to curating, or kind of like event organizing, if you kind of want to think about it in a very large sense. What was that like for you? Of these are things you've been thinking about and kind of wrestling with and talking about through writing for so many years, to kind of now wrestle with these ideas in a much larger context. What was that like?
I mean, I think you have to understand that you're going to lose control. Like it's a little bit like, I mean, I cannot say that I know what the experience of conducting an orchestra is, because I have no idea. But I feel like everybody gets a score, and then they either do it or they do whatever. I don't know. Maybe they're improvising, and you're just trying to keep it all together, but you can't, and that's the beauty of it. The thing that I have to say that I have loved more about all my experiences around curating is how much I am surprised by everything that happens, and how much I have to. Of course, you need to control a bunch of things and you need to be on top of everything, but not knowing, especially in these kinds of processes, because if you're working mostly with contemporary practitioners, which we're doing, if you're working mostly with new commissions, which is what we were doing, if you're working mostly with a context that is new and people don't know each other, there is an amount of uncertainty that is going to happen. Yeah. And that's beautiful. But because that is definitely one of the ways in which magic can happen. And I'm going to read you here a quote. There was when we did Bio 50, so the Ljubljana Biennial in 2014, we also tested out a completely different way of working. So we had groups of designers working together for 6 months, and then things had to come out. We weren't sure what was going to come out, if anything. So the risk factor is huge, right? But I think only if you have a huge amount of risk can you really try and do something that is innovative, or try to be innovative. Because otherwise, it's just. I mean, you cannot change the molds if you don't test out other molds, I would say. And I think that's what we tried to do with Istanbul at a much, much larger scale than what we did with Ljubljana. And at the end of the day, what we observed is that there were a bunch of things that were unpredictable, and that there were a bunch of things that we couldn't really control at all. And I want to read you a quote of like a guy that wrote kind of an analysis piece about Ljubljana. He has this really interesting way of looking at it. In the end, he said, his name is Michael Kapler, and he wrote this in 2015, and he said, Bio 50, which was the name of the biennial in Ljubljana, he said, Bio 50 provides a palette of diverse design collaborations with many lessons learned. In particular, it has demonstrated how uncertainty, variety, and ambiguity can be used as conditions to seed communities of design practice. So in his view, basically, uncertainty, variety, and ambiguity in a certain combination can create, let's say, a future for design. And I guess he just said in a very articulated way. We weren't really thinking about how we were going to talk about when we did it, but I have to say that I feel that's what we tried to do. And I'm not sure that we have had any success, because I think these things are complex and they take time, and we will only be able to look back at it in 10 years and see, or 15 years and see. But it's an attempt. And I have to say, I'm very thankful that these platforms trust these crazy ideas, because I'm not sure that a lot of people would give space for these things to happen. I'm thankful for these platforms, or the platform, for example, of the Istanbul Design Biennial and the Ljubljana Biennial before it, gave us that platform and the opportunity to test those things out.
What's on your mind now, or like what are the subjects that you're thinking about now?
Well, so very recently I did something called A Woman's Work, which was a conference organized with Matilda Krzyzkowski, who's also a curator, and she's now in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute as a guest professor. We came together a few years ago and started thinking about how could we talk about issues of women in design and the arts in general, and then we started something we called Foreign Legion, which is a moniker for a loose association in which we come together and talk about issues of women and design. And so we organized a symposium in Dresden at the Museum of Applied Arts there on the visibility of women, of contemporary women, women practitioners. So that was a very interesting exercise, and we're definitely working more on that theme in the next months and in the next year, definitely. So on the one hand, that, and on the other hand, with the Istanbul experience, one of the things that I did there was I was taking care of the public program, and I've been doing public programming for a number of years now, also with this passion project that I was telling you earlier, which is called TEOK, The Edge of Knowledge, a series of lectures that I organize here in Basel. They take place in people's living rooms, and you have to talk about something that you're passionate about and that you know a lot about, but it cannot be your job. So nothing that is related to your job. So this really forces people to go into their like passions that they kind of forgot about, and that's a super passion project, and I love it so much. But what I understand is that through public programming and through event creation and curating, you create these informal networks of people that they're so interesting, and the impact that they can have in the future, the long term, is very, very unstudied. And I find that this is something I really want to dedicate some time to doing, and especially in today's political climate, both in Europe and the United States. I find that connecting that to the idea of some sort of activism is something that really interests me. And I want to try and understand how I can connect these two things in a more focused and structured way. And that's what I'm trying to dedicate my time to in the next let's say in the next 12 months.
I love that. That's such a good idea.
Yeah. Because, like we all come together to talk about funny things, but could we also come together to talk about more serious? I don't know. I mean, it's definitely, so on the one hand, these sort of issues of like representation, visibility of women in design. So let's say maybe a more feminist strand of thought. And on the other hand, this more activist strand of thought. I feel like those are the things that I'm interested in. And I have to say, like, working on these issues of contemporary design, to me, like they bring me closer and closer to this idea of design's not going to matter in the next 10 years if we don't do something about it. So we need to act fast. We need to sort of figure out that we are very much responsible for the future of this field. And if we don't start doing things about it right now, there won't be a design field, but also there won't be a planet, by the way. So maybe we could all just, we're just talking about human survival here.
Yeah.
In the big picture, this is what it is about. So I feel like if we don't start, taking our responsibility, I mean, we are all part of the problem, right? So and part of the solution as well. So let's to end on that sort of hopeful note. I feel like there's so much that can be done, but people just have to understand that their responsibilities towards their field are not just in making a beautifully crafted chair. And it hasn't been like that for a while now, but now it's becoming radically and dramatically obvious.
Yeah. In an attempt to not end this on a complete down note, I have one final question, and this is a question that I used to end all of these conversations. And you've mentioned a couple people throughout this conversation, but what are the books, or who are the people or the critics or the writers that have really influenced you and how you think about all of this that we've been talking about today?
Oh, that's a good question, and I have to say there's got to be like some phases in my life, right? So I'm going to start with my early inspirations. I have to say that the team that started Design Observer for me was, of course, Jessica, William, Michael. They are one of, they were my first inspirations. Stephen Heller, Ellen Lupton, J. Abbott Miller, definitely. The Emigrate team, and anyone that wrote an Emigrate, really. It was just so good. It was just so good. It just changed my life. And as it happens very often, it's through reading that you completely change your worldview sometimes. And then at Decrit, everyone that I encountered there, from Alice, who was the chair of the program at the time, to faculty members, Julie Lasky, Akiko Bush, they were so, Palantinelli was also teaching there at the time, Alexander Lang, Harry Jacob. I could go on for days. And then in my profession now, my practice now, I'm lucky to come across, more than reading their books, like to have wonderful conversations with extremely inspiring people. And I've worked now, first I was working with under Joseph Grima at Domus, and he is a huge inspiration. And I've been lucky enough in the last 5 years to be working a lot with Jan Boelen, and he is an incredible inspiration, and I learned so much from him. So right now I feel like more than reading, and I've been reading a lot of sort of crazy feminist and ecological concerns prose, which, those are the things that concern me nowadays. But, I find a lot of joy and inspiration in working with people and talking with them. So, just recently, I've been working a lot with Matilda Krzkowski. She's also an amazing person. And really, I'm so lucky and happy to sort of be able to encounter wonderful people on a daily basis and to learn so much from all of them. I just don't know. It's like flying a plane. I'm not sure for how long we're going to be able to be doing that realistically as a species. But I'm not sure how long I will be able to have this amazing life where I encounter amazing people on a daily basis. And I just hope that I can learn as much as I can while I still have the chance, because I learn every single day from so many crazily talented people. So thank you. And you.
Well, no, I thank you, because I was going to say I'm completely with you on this idea of conversation, and so much of the people who have influenced me it's come through conversation, and that's like totally what this podcast is about, is a place for me to, like I mentioned to you before we started recording, is to just talk to people who are smarter than me about things that I'm thinking about. And so I'm so glad that you now get to be a part of this conversation too. I thought this was so fun and so interesting. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. It was great.
This episode was recorded on February 7th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.